listener production.
Hey, it's Antoinette Lattouf with your weekend briefing, where I get to talk to some pretty impressive humans behind the headlines. And it is 2025. Happy New Year. So, of course, it's that time of the year when we're all setting resolutions. So let me toss an idea your way. How about owning multiple properties by the end of the year? Sounds a bit crazy, right? Like a bit of a pipe dream. Well, my guest today might change your mind. Eddie Dilleen went from living on welfare with his mum to building a $90 million property portfolio, and he's still in his 30s. Eddie's got a passion for buying property, but he's not buying into the idea that people his age are priced out of the market. He believes it's possible to be a homeowner. Yes, there are some caveats and some sacrifices that need to be made, which we get into. But he's now focused on showing young people how they can take steps towards what he calls buying happiness. And later in the show, it's the weekend list. It's your go-to guide for what to watch, see, do, eat and listen to. And as always, I enlist the help of my fabulous producer, Helen Smith. But first, let's dive into my chat with Eddie Dilleen. Eddie Dilleen, welcome to the weekend briefing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Important question, and I always like to ask the most important question up first. Do you order smashed avocado and crumbed feta on toast at fancy cafes? Or is not ordering them the key to your real estate portfolio?
In the early stages, I did not order a smashed avocado very much. Nowadays, thankfully, I'm able to, but hold the feta because the wife does not like feta at all.
Right. Okay, but you understand the sentiment.
Yes.
There was the real estate mogul Tim Gurner who said it, the millionaire real estate mogul demographer Bernard Salt, who said millennials and young Australians, they want to have their property, but they can't help but order overpriced smashed avocado on toast. Is it as simple as that?
It's definitely not as simple as that. Like when I was starting off and growing up and building my portfolio in my late teens and early 20s, like I did still enjoy myself, go out and have fun, but I did it on a budget as well. So it wouldn't be avocado every day, but once a week, that's perfectly fine. I believe you can have your cake and eat it too if you play the game right and you learn as much as you can about property investing.
We're going to learn a bit more about property investing, but I want to learn about you first because you went from living in housing commission and you describe yourself as being quite broke to having over $90 million worth of property by the age of 32. You've said you were basically in poverty, and I want to know what that means and what that looked like exactly.
Yeah, so I grew up in a suburb called Mount Druitt, and within that area lived in an actual suburb called Wilmot. And that Wilmot has actually been on the news for over a decade as being notorious one of the worst places to live in Sydney.
It's one of the most disadvantaged in Western Sydney, or in Sydney as a whole, yes.
Yes. So obviously I grew up with a single mother on a pension, so she was older. My mum was a late in life surprise is what they like to say. And she was on the pension. No one in my family owned a property at all. No one invested in a property. It wasn't even the thing that people talk about. And the street that we lived in, like every other house was getting literally lit on fire because when a house would go vacant or someone would move out of housing commission, it was like the locals would literally burn down the house. So it was like a scene out of like a war movie even walking out to the letterbox, everyone I remember being told as a child, just be careful, there might be drug needles on the ground near the letterbox. So that was the kind of atmosphere I grew up from literally from when I was born to like late teens.
And did you go without in terms of food and basic necessities?
Yeah, it was very mum's pension was only probably $200 a week at the time, and we were left with nothing. Food was always a problem. I remember we would have to we lived in America for a couple of years, and we were on food stamps and all that kind of stuff. So it was just it was a very tough time, and it was just to me, you look back and I was that was a essence of trauma going through that kind of experience. And even going to the school that I went to, it was a very underprivileged kind of lower social economic kind of area that I lived in. It was just I didn't know any better back then. But it was that kind of pain, I believe, and, being overwhelmed and feeling very hopeless during that time, which kind of, I believe, lit a fire in my stomach to be in the future, I don't want to live here, like in this kind of situation anymore. I cannot like be in this kind of area forever. I cannot be around this type of, issues and bad type of environment. So I was like, and this is when I'm figuring this out when I was, 14, 15 years old. I'm like, all right, so if I work my ass off for X amount of time, then by the time I'm 25 or 35 or whatever it may be, if I do things right and do the complete opposite to what everyone else is doing around me, and the complete opposite was actually getting a job, actually trying to learn and trying to figure out how successful people actually get ahead. And obviously that's where I was like, oh, successful people that have more wealth and actually don't live in this rough area that I live in, and they live in the big nice houses, they invest in property. And then a light bulb went off and I was like, oh, I better learn about property.
So you say you had that feeling that you knew you wanted to break that cycle. It was about 14 or 15 years of age. How many years until you purchased that first property?
I got my first job when I was 14 years old, and I was working at McDonald's and KFC, etc. while I was going to school. Saved up about $20,000 over the course of 2 years. So per week it was like $200. It wasn't much that I was putting away, but it was a lot to me back then. $20,000 I had at the age of 18, just over 18, I bought my first investment property, which is in the Central Coast, hour and a half north. And the reason why that was there and not where I lived is because even back then I couldn't afford a property in Western Sydney, because even back then it was very expensive. And I was only able to, the bank, after being knocked down by like 12 different banks, finally a bank said, oh, you can borrow $140,000 if you rent it out as an investment property, because they'll take the rental income into consideration then. So you were able to get an apartment for $140,000 or thereabouts? Correct. 2-bedroom unit apartment, yeah.
How many properties do you now own?
Over 100. I don't know the exact number, but over 100. It was 106, 107, something like that, yeah.
I mean, that's wild. It's amazing and impressive. Do you think that boy in Wilmot would believe that you're sitting here today owning 100 properties?
Definitely not. Absolutely not. Back then, when I first got started, I bought the first property. I felt that I was ahead of my peers at that time, because most of the other people that were 18 didn't have a property, and I was like, wow, this is great. But then over the course of 1, 2, 3 years after that, like I didn't really buy another property until I was 21. Then I just did the normal thing as a teenager, and I kind of thought that I was, really, really, like that was success at the time. But then over time when I was like 22, 23, and I started noticing that, wait a minute, like you actually can't stop at one property, because one property doesn't solve the issue of wealth at all. Like you can't, you don't get, super ahead just by owning one property. And then I found out other people had 2 or 3 or 4, and I was like, wow, I better buy some more.
So was your key to work a lot, save as much money, as opposed to going and studying? Because haven't come across anything post high school that you studied.
Yeah, so funny story about that. So growing up in the very like rough kind of area and that environment, like all my friends and that were at school, I went to a high school called Plumpton High, and that was actually very notoriously known as Plumpton. It was a nickname, Plumpton Pram Pushers, because they used to have a daycare at Plumpton High.
There was a SBS documentary series, I believe, about the teenage mothers at Plumpton High.
Yes.
Quite a few years ago.
Absolutely. Plumpton High, yes. Very, very famous. It was a good school was a lot of fun at that school. I didn't learn quite a lot. But at that time, I was so involved in just, hanging out with friends, being a kid and all that kind of stuff. I wasn't like, I was good in some areas, but I didn't get good grades or anything like that. I couldn't concentrate very well in school. And some people were like, oh, you might have had ADHD. I never got tested. I don't know. But wasn't really concentrating. So at that time, like, I didn't even know what university was. Like it wasn't even on the radar. It was just every person that I lived out with, because they were out that kind of areas, like they were going to be a tradie. They were going to be bricklayer, concreter, X, Y, and they were like, so back then I'm downloading all this information. I'm like, oh, well, I'll just work outside. I didn't even know. I thought you had to go to America to go to university. Australia had university.
Yeah, wow.
So by the time I was like 18 or like around that age, I was so fixating on buying a property. I was just like, I've got to work to buy a property. I've got to work at McDonald's, and I've got to save as much money. Like university wasn't even a thing. I didn't even think about it. Like I didn't even know it was on the radar.
But you were saying you were educating yourself about the property market. Where did you educate yourself? What did you turn to?
YouTube was just coming out back then. There was a small amount of YouTube videos about property investing and people documenting their property investment stories and things like that. So I watched things like that. More than ever, I just read as many books as I could, even though I hated reading. And again, I couldn't concentrate very, very well on reading, but I forced myself to read property investment books. And like, obviously there's a famous book called Rich Dad Poor Dad that everyone has heard of. So that has an essence of property investing in it. And then I've looked up more books about property investing and just different strategies. And I just tried to immerse myself in that and learn as much as possible.
Now you're trying to teach people about, I guess, real estate literacy. What is the most common question asked of you?
Most common question, I would say, is, it's a good question, where should I buy? I would say people will be like, where should I buy right now? That would be like the easiest short-term kind of question. And with every question, it's a very open-ended answer, and it depends on like what the person wants to do. Like if a person wants to buy now, I don't know if they want to live in the property, or I don't know if they want to invest in the property. So if they want to live in the property, obviously you want to buy where you want to live. But if you want to invest in the property, it may not be where you live. It might be in another suburb, it might be another state altogether.
But there are schools of thought that suggest you don't need to buy where you live, in that you can live where you want to live and rent it and buy elsewhere. Do you subscribe to that thought?
Absolutely, for sure. Like if I was starting again and starting absolutely from scratch and I lived in Sydney, I would absolutely rent first and then buy as many affordable investment properties as I could to build up the capital. Like if you do the maths and the actual numbers, especially with interest rates right now, let's say you're living in a $2.5 million property in Sydney, like the mortgage repayments on that might be like $3,000 a week, but you could probably rent the property for like $1,400 a week. So you're $2,000 a week better off. And that's not for everybody. Like if you have a lot of property and then over time you build up a lot of equity and you become super, wealthy or whatever, then you can buy a place to live because it doesn't matter. But if you're a person out there and you're starting off and you're 20 or 30 or 40 and you're just trying to get in the property market, you don't have any assets, then it's better to, rent first majority of time, and then that amount of that 1,000 or 2,000 that you would have saved, that could be going into investing in a property, which will make way more money over time, and you'll get tax deductions.
A lot of people that I know who are struggling to get into the property market are currently renting, and rents are quite expensive, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, but also places like Canberra. And they say, look, it's nigh impossible to save as well as rent. When you were saving up for your first few properties, were you still living at home? Because that often differentiates those who can and can't get that first foot into the housing market.
Yeah, so when I first started saving, I was 16, so I definitely was living at home. So 16 to 18, I was living at home. After that, I did move out, but I still had to obviously save and pay rent and everything like that. But the first one was living at home for sure.
There are a lot of articles, particularly by Gen Z and millennials, or lots of conversations on social media about how the circumstances are almost impossible for them to get into the housing market unless you have intergenerational wealth, or unless you can stay living with your family until you're 30 and saving up. Do you think it's that hard?
I believe it's hard, but I believe that you have to have the right attitude towards it. Like if a person says, oh, it's too hard, it's nearly impossible, and then that spreads to thousands and thousands of other people, then that's like the standard sentiment that everyone's going to, believe. But if you have that kind of attitude, then you never really get anywhere in life. So I believe, yes, it's hard, but it's always been hard. Like there's documents and videos from like 1990, 1987, even before I was born, about how expensive Sydney was even back then. So you can do it, but you've got to sacrifice. Like I know people personally that they haven't bought a property, as an example, for 15 years. We were very close friends, etc. then, but they still haven't bought a property. But like that's because they wanted to, at that time, rent a place, which was, as an example, like $800. And when it was just a single person, where they could have rented a unit for like $400, but they wanted the status of having a bigger house and that kind of, material kind of mindset of, they want people to perceive them. Whereas like back when I was starting out, I didn't wear designer clothes, didn't do that. Like you have to sacrifice massively. So you can't be showing off and like pretending to be rich when you're not rich and buying all that kind of stuff.
Look, I understand a positive attitude goes a long way, and that some people spend more than they probably can, or they have lifestyles that suggest they earn more money. But it is also difficult to ignore that housing affordability in Australia has reached an all-time low. And the vast majority of medium income households are now almost excluded from the property market in terms of affordability. That, coupled with interest rates, do you accept that this is, irrespective of how frugal you are, that it's harder than ever now to buy property? I can see by your face you don't. I can see you're like, not really.
You're like, yeah, playing devil's advocate, I don't believe it's harder than ever. I believe it is.
Why not? Why is it not harder than ever?
Because, like, as an example, when I started off buying my first investment property, like at that time, the banks were only allowed to do a 10% deposit. Now the banks were allowed to do a 5% deposit. Interest rates were roughly the same as they were when I started. They're about 7%, and now they're about 6.5%, 7%. But you can get in, like, if you learn the system about financial banking and, how to get loans and all the stuff they don't teach you in school. So the system is designed to, for it to be hard, unfortunately. So, but if you try to play the game, as an example, let's say someone only has $20,000. Mm-hmm. I had $20K back then, and let's say I've got $20K right now. If I was going to buy an investment property and I lived in Sydney, I wouldn't buy in Sydney because obviously it's the rental return and it's overpriced, et cetera, et cetera. But you can buy in an affordable state like as Perth or Melbourne. Melbourne has actually been a really bad place to invest the last 2 years. It's actually gone down. There's, issues with government.
Could you get a 2-bedroom apartment for $140,000 anywhere in Australia?
You can, but I would still, so Melbourne as an example, right?
Yeah.
Melbourne, you can get, like, we've bought properties there recently. I bought properties there for like $300K recently. Mm-hmm. You can do a 5% deposit on $300K would be $15,000. If you're like, even stamp duty on top of that, you'd be in there for about $20K. So deposit-wise, you can still get into the same amount. Property-wise, $140,000, you can buy a property, but it would be more regional. It'd be like a 2-bedroom unit in like Cairns, as an example, which is still a property nonetheless. Like owning a property is owning a property. Just like when I bought in Central Coast, I wasn't living in it, so it didn't really matter if I was if it was in the Central Coast or in Cairns or in wherever. I'm not saying buy in Cairns, but I'm just saying that there is properties for $140K, and you still can get in for $20,000.
My producer is nodding her head and taking notes because she has been furiously searching for property. She pays her own rent, supports herself, and wants to get in the property market, but has had to look outside of Sydney. So I'm getting lots of nods of approval from Helen and note-taking. I'm keen to know how you're received by some of your friends or even peers in the real estate industry, because we do love a rags to riches story in Australia, but we also hate a tall poppy.
Oh, yeah.
And so how do you find people react to your story?
I'd say 60% would be negative, 40% would be positive about it.
Negative, how so?
A lot of people say, look, why should he be able to own so many properties? Like, that shouldn't be allowed. He's taking advantages away from other people that could be buying those properties. No one deserves to have that much amount of properties, etc. Those standard stuff.
Well, I mean, there's no quota on how much property you can own.
Correct. There's people. There's people in the world that own thousands, tens of thousands of blocks of thousands of units. Like, they're either owned. Even if a company owns a block of units, like the Meriton as an example, or something like that. Still someone runs that company. That is an individual that technically owns those properties that are in thousands. So my 100 properties is nothing compared to that. But I understand it. And I can understand where people are coming from, because when I grew up in Wilmot, in Mount Druitt, in that terrible kind of atmosphere, I had the same kind of mentality, or even probably worse, because I was like, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. This sucks. There's nothing they can do about it. I was dealt a bad hand of cards, basically. I was born into a poor family, even though I have an amazing family, love my family, but I was born into one that didn't have any money and blah, 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 and it's everyone else's fault, and I'm never going to get ahead. That's how I was at first. And then I was like, if I have that attitude and I just keep going, well, then I'm going to be stuck here. Yeah. So I've got to try to do something.
Do you think a positive attitude and a few lifestyle sacrifices is all a young person needs to get into the property market?
They're probably it's not all they need, I would say. Yeah. Obviously, they would need the right kind of mindset and delayed gratification kind of, in a sense. If someone can, go 2, 3, 4 years with that kind of attitude and have a goal that they're working towards, and if they can save up over time and sacrifice small things. And
when did you first go overseas?
I definitely sacrificed that. So first I went overseas to properly travel, I'd say when I was 25, 26.
Yeah,
roughly.
So that's, 6 years? 8 years after, my maths is terrible. How many years? When you bought your first property at 18, right?
18, yes,
so
7 years.
So that's 7 years after you bought your first property.
Yeah.
Did your friends think you were nuts at the time? Because they're like, hey, let's go to Bali. And you're like, no, I'm doing this shift at Macca's because I'm working, earning double time and a half so I can save for my property.
Oh, yeah, I thought it was crazy. Like, not a lot of, I guess, thankfully, but not a lot of them were traveling all throughout Europe and all that kind of stuff. Because even being in the rough kind of area, like, people didn't travel to Europe. They would like, we're going to Bali or the Max. That would be, but even then they wouldn't go to Bali. They would be like,
the Gold Coast.
We're going to Surfers. Exactly. Surfers Paradise would be the thing, schoolies, and that's it. So
you didn't go to schoolies?
I went there like 3 years after.
Yeah, right.
Well, I did it when I was like 21. Afterwards.
You've written a book that is free to download for people to understand property. Why did you do that?
I did it to, I guess, explain to people how I did it, give them a hope, inspiration that if there was another person like that was in a similar kind of atmosphere or really bad type of environment that I grew up, or underprivileged, etc., or growing up in poverty, didn't have any money, that they would be able to see that it is possible to get ahead. Obviously, it's free. People can download it for free. Like, it has all the tips, tricks, and strategies. It was my way of, giving back to, people that are even interested. Like, not everyone's going to be interested in it, but it's my way of documenting and giving something back to other property investors and spreading, I guess, some type of positivity out there about how you can get ahead despite where you were born into.
One of the things you do point out is that you avoid auctions. Why is that?
I try to, although admittedly I was at an auction about last week, but auctions, they put a lot of the cards in the seller's hands. Like, it's builds up, atmosphere, momentum for the seller. And most of the properties that I buy and have bought over the last 10 years have been like off-market sales before they've even gone on real estate or domain. If you go to auction, obviously you can get emotionally involved, and that's very dangerous. Like, if there's like 10 people bidding at auction, like, something gets pushed more than we're expecting it to go for. The guides in Sydney are ridiculous, and in Australia in general, the guides are crazy. Like, there's auctions often for the guide is 2 million, and then it sells for 3.1.
Yeah.
So if you don't, and that's the average type of, if someone's starting out and they're like, this is rigged, like, what's going on here? Like, they don't understand. So there's, again, no one teaches it in school, and like, there's not proper an education kind of course. And that's another thing like why I wrote the book, and just to, because everyone was asking so many questions. I was like, I've answered this question 20,000 times. Like, read the book.
What would you suggest can be done policy-wise to make it easier for young people? Yes, there's individual autonomy, individual sacrifice, individual mindset changing, but there are structural issues and governance issues that hinder young people entering the property market. What do you think would make it easier?
The first thing that comes to mind, that's a very good question, but I haven't been asked that before. First thing that comes to mind is probably more education in schools about actually, people go to work experience. They get work experience in school. They do all that kind of stuff in school. There should be even one type of small class or bits of information about buying a property or investing in property, or even kind of taxation. Because you don't learn anything about accounting at school or a tax, but everyone has to do a tax return, or everyone's got to learn that terminology after school. So there would be some type of thing that, I believe should be implemented in some type of schools or high school, where people are learning about, buying a property. What is stamp duty, as an example?
Yeah.
Like, I never learned that at school. Yes. It should be taught in school.
Yeah. So have you achieved the great Australian dream 100 times, given you own a lot of bricks and mortar? Is that the dream, or does the dream look different for you?
The dream looks different to me. Like, I believe everyone has, like, the Australian dream, obviously people say, is buying your own house and owning it. So if that's someone's version, then yes, I've done it 100 times, over 100 times. But my version would be to, build up a platform of assets, whether it's property or whatever else, that provides a person the freedom to do what they want when they want, and whether it's spend more time with the family and have the option to do a job that they really enjoy doing. Because I remember being stuck at, McDonald's or KFC, and there's nothing wrong with those jobs, but I did not like it there, and I felt like, and there's 1,000 other jobs that I did over the years, which it was mind-numbing. It was terrible. Like, I just hated doing it. So the dream for me would be, and that I feel like I'm living at the moment, is because I am very passionate about property investing, and it's one of the things I've always, wanted to do, is doing what you want when you want, having the option. And to me, it's if I'm able to buy properties that can, grow in equity over time, that puts me in the position, then that's it.
And where's Mum living at the moment?
I bought Mum a house about 2 years ago, literally around the corner from us. So I got her out of housing commission, thankfully. And she doesn't live out really far out west. She lives around the corner from us.
So you're 33, you've gotten that flexibility, you've achieved the great Australian dream in the traditional sense, and in your sense, still very young. What's next?
I'd like to travel more, for one. I'd like to, I obviously didn't travel between the ages of 18 to 25. I'd like to travel more, but also I want to continue growing and building my portfolio and also helping others and spreading, writing more books, etc. like that, even if they're all given away for free. Like, it's not about, that anymore. It's about trying to continue to build my portfolio. And I believe, like, people always have, and I had the same dream years and years ago before I knew what I knew now, but it's like once you get to a certain stage, then you just do nothing and you lie on the beach and you move to wherever you want to move to and you just do nothing forever.
That's actually boring.
It is.
Yeah.
So I didn't figure that out until afterwards. So I was like, worked like crazy, worked my ass off for all this time, and I was like, all right, I'm going to quit now and I'm just going to move to the beach and not do anything and just, drink cocktails all day and just relax on the beach in the sun. But then after, doing that even on holidays, I'm like, you need something to keep your mind active. That's just human nature. So anyone that thinks they're going to be able to just build something or do something or work really hard or be successful and then switch off, it does not happen, unfortunately, which is a good thing as well.
Amazing. Well, I look forward to seeing what comes next for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Eddie Dilleen of Dilleen Property. And if you want to download that 200-page book for free, the book's called 30 Properties Before 30. You can download that for free on his website, dilleenpropertyau.com.au.